So we are in a water quality seminar, so maybe we're on the same page, but I do just want to talk a little bit to get on the same page about what is non-point source pollution. Non-point source pollution refers to water pollution that emanates from the landscape broadly. This is in contrast to point source pollution. You can think about this maybe in the context of a factory that has a single pipe, and all of the pollution is coming out of this pipe directly into water, easy to measure, and relatively easy to regulate, right? But non-point source pollution looks more like this. This is a photo of a dairy farm in Wisconsin in the late spring where we've had rainfall coming onto fields that were frozen or still had snow on them. And we can see that there is a lot of transportation of whatever's on the soil surface as well as some of the soil itself, and it's now running off into surface water. Non-point source pollution is a national issue. I have grabbed just a handful of newspaper headlines from Michigan, from Oregon, from Pennsylvania. So big geographical spaces, but you can really count on that wherever we have agriculture, we have surface water, we have rain, there's going to be conversations happening about non-point source pollution. We're going to focus on Wisconsin today, in part because Wisconsin is a really nice microcosm of agriculture and water issues. Wisconsin has a really strong agricultural sector, both crop and livestock, primarily dairy production. It has really, really lovely natural resources in terms of water resources. And as a result, we are having lots of issues around water pollution. We are having health expenses, we are having challenges with using those natural resources. And now there's a lot of conversation around what do we do? How do we legislate this? How do we regulate it? And so it's just a sort of, like I said, this case study of broader issues in non-point. So there is an existing literature on agriculture and water quality, but the top line headline is that non-point source pollution from agriculture is really, really hard to measure and to identify and to improve because it's coming broadly from the landscape, right? So Kathy Kling wrote about this in 2012, Robato and Shortle wrote a really nice piece in 2019, sort of laying out the problem. But fortunately, we do have this relatively new and quickly growing literature that is trying to dive into this problem because it is so important that regardless of how challenging it is to measure and identify, it still warrants study. So actually we have one of the pioneers in the literature in the room with us. So Zach Raff and his colleague in 2020 showed that animal agriculture, specifically large scale dairy farms, do have negative impacts on water quality. And then Podell and Crago more recently, or actually in the same year, excuse me, showed that crop agriculture and fertilizer also have a negative impact on water quality. And then there's a budding literature on policies in non-point. So we have Chen et al. In 2020 looking at the Clean Water Act and hog CAFOs in Iowa. We have Liu, Wang, and Zhang more recently looking at EQIP. And then I have a paper with the same team looking at the effects of local manure management regulations in Wisconsin. In every single case, we find mixed effects of the policies, right? So some encouraging evidence and some not so encouraging evidence. Now, this literature, like I said, it's growing, it's strong, but one thing that's consistent throughout what we have done so far is that it's always estimating average treatment effects across weather situations, across climate, right? What we actually do need to be thinking about is that climate change is likely to exacerbate the problem that we've already identified, right? So there's a strong literature in mainly the hydrology space, right? So we're using edge of field data or micro watershed data and finding that really it's our rainfall, irrigation, and snow melt that are the catalysts for transporting nutrients from the soil surface to our surface water, or actually transporting the soil itself through erosion, right? So soil can actually have nutrients bonded to it. And so if you then drag the soil to the surface water, you're also bringing the nutrients along with it. And then adding on to this, there's some evidence that increased frequency of heavy rainfall and flooding will increase agricultural runoff, right? So if runoff occurs when there's heavy rainfall and you get more heavy rainfall, we would expect to have more runoff. And so that's what we're going to look at today. First, we're going to ask, what is the effect of heavy rainfall on surface water nutrient concentration? So really, we're taking our econometric models for a spin on this larger scale data, and we're going to replicate the conclusions of small scale studies. But what we're adding is that we're able to look at this at a multi-watershed scale, and we're going to be able to add some granularity on temporal effects. But then what we do is we ask how land use change affects the severity of nutrient runoff during rainfall events. And what we find is that crop and animal agriculture of any scale exacerbate the effects of heavy rainfall on runoff, but cover crops do mitigate the runoff. So how will we do this? We bring together a host of data sources. Our outcome data comes from the Water Quality Portal, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a fantastic resource. We are going to look at all of the surface water quality readings, and we're looking at filtered ammonia as a proxy for nitrogen. It's an imperfect proxy, but there's just very few nitrogen readings, unfortunately. And we'll also look at total phosphorus concentrations. Our treatment data comes from PRISM. So we look at precipitation as our main treatment data. We do, though, include temperature, because if you're including one climate variable, it's best practices to throw the rest in. And then our land use data comes from, we have non-CAFO, so under 1,000 head dairy farm addresses and operating dates from the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture. Then we have our CAFO data. These are the over 1,000 head dairy farms from Zach Graff, and then his panel goes up until, I believe, 2017, and then we worked with the DNR to extend that panel forward. And then we use the CDL to know where crop production is in the state, and this is from the USDA. We worked with Optus data on cover cropping. This is from the Conservation Technology Information Center, also a great resource. And then we know where our point source pollution is coming from NPDES permits from EPA. All right, so we're going to look at this from about 2007 until 2020, bring together all these data sources and put them in a fixed effects model. So our outcome is the log concentration, or the level concentration of phosphorus or ammonia. And we're looking at the reading at a single monitoring station in a given Huck 8. And with this reading, we know the day on which it occurred, and then we can identify the month and the year, right? So our observation level is a single reading and a single station and a single day. Our treatment is precipitation in the Huck 8. Oh goodness, well, but we also have this daily precipitation, so we can match the precipitation on the day of the water quality reading. We include year fixed effects to control for any phenomena that are happening across the state in the year. We have month fixed effects that are taking into account that we see pretty significant seasonal variation in water quality. Again, sort of especially related to that we see really poor nutrient, really high nutrient concentrations in the spring on average with snow melt and things like that. We have Huck 8 fixed effects, and then we cluster standard errors at the Huck 8 year level. So this is the specification we'll use just to estimate the average effects of heavy rainfall in a given day. But then we'll also include the main and interaction effects of watershed activities in a heterogeneity analysis. So these activities we measure at the year level, and we look at, for example, what is the amount of cropping in the Huck 8 in that year, and use that to then interact with our daily rainfall. To give you a little bit of a sense of the identification and where it's coming from, we have really big variation in rainfall, both across time and across space. So one of the ways we'll measure extreme rain is just more than 1 inch in a day. And this is the number of days that you have more than 1 inch in a year. And you can see that there's variation, like I said, across time and space. So first of all, what do we find just in terms of what is the impact of rainfall, either in that day or the previous day, on nutrient concentrations in the Huck 8? or at that station, excuse me. We find that if there is a ½ an inch of rainfall to 1 inch compared to our base category of less than ½ an inch, we do find significant spikes in ammonia and phosphorus. That spike gets bigger if it's 1 to 2 inches compared to the base category, even bigger if it's 2 or more inches, right? So this is what we would expect. Rainfall causes runoff, more rain causes more runoff. And we do find that these levels are still elevated the next day, but there's about a 50% drop, right, from day 1 to day 2. Next, we can look at this even a little more over a little bit of a longer period. Now we're going to just focus on binary treatment, either a ½ inch of rainfall or 1 inch of rainfall. And once again, we find spikes for both nutrients if there is significant rainfall in the day. With ammonia, we see that fall off pretty quickly, just 1 or 2 days out that we still see ammonia elevated. With phosphorus, though, we see significant, the spike remains up to 5 days later, although it again falls off by about 50% the first day, and then even farther days 2, 3, 4. So next, we start thinking about this in terms of how is the land being used. And I did omit the main effects just for brevity, but what we're really interested in here is the interaction of land use and precipitation. Once again, we find that on average and here this is just a 1 inch of rainfall indicator, that if we have more than an inch of rain, we do see spikes in ammonia and phosphorus. What we see with phosphorus, we really actually gain quite a bit of traction with these interaction variables. And we see positive and significant interaction between our CAFO agriculture and precipitation, between our non-CAFO dairy agriculture and precipitation, and with row crop agriculture. But we see a negative and significant interaction between cover cropping and rainfall. And this interaction term is really, really robust. Now, I would caution against interpreting this on a 0-1. The most cover cropping that we ever see in our Huck 8s is 20% of the total row cropped area, right? So I'll offer, so you could instead think of this in terms of, we see a 73% spike in phosphorus if there's an inch of rain. But if you had 10% of cover crops, of row crop area and cover crops, actually that would mitigate it by 48%. All right, so we have a number of additional specifications. We interact our lag indicators and find no evidence that the results attenuate if you have consecutive days of rain. We do test the model with Huck 8 by year, by month fixed effects. So then we're just identifying off of variation within the Huck 8 within the month. We still find the same conclusions, although the coefficients are smaller. The results hold for just a linear model of rainfall. We're thinking about conservation tillage. Optus also has this data, but we're having a little bit of trouble gaining traction because we see really strong correlation between just increased crop acreage, which we would expect to increase the interaction with rainfall, and then also conservation tillage. So if any of you have thought about this, have worked with this, I'd love to chat and get some ideas where to go. But to conclude, our basic models reflect the edge of field and micro watershed findings, which is really nice to sort of have the intuitive results come through really strongly. We see a 62% spike of ammonia, 84% spike of phosphorus, after 1 inch of rainfall in that same day. The effect increases with the amount of rain and it decreases in the following days. But we also find that the phosphorus effects are significantly higher in watersheds with higher agricultural activity. If you were in the mean Huck 8 with all of the mean values for ag, that would be a further 50% spike. But cover crops, we also find significantly reduce the effect around rainfall events. So at the mean level of cover cropping, that's about a 20% reduction in the spike, which suggests, I think, that cover crops are a really important part of an climate smart ag portfolio. So thank you all. This is my new email address where you can reach me already. So thanks, and I look forward to your questions. We're doing them now, Pablo? Yeah, great. Fantastic. Yes. Hi. I was wondering if there's a way to dollar value to
I mean, I understand the problem with my watershed.
Yes.
And you know what they're doing, the downstream of the water.
Yes.
Obviously, but that would be interesting.
Mhm.
But it's hard to sort of-
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I am not a valuation economist, unfortunately. And to my knowledge, now have somebody else who works in the same watershed here, and maybe he knows of some really good valuation papers, but
Use somebody else's numbers.
yeah, well, and that's the problem, is that to my knowledge, there are not other numbers that are actually valuing these nutrients in water in Wisconsin. And it, in my opinion, is quite irresponsible. There's numbers in the Gulf, there's numbers in Chesapeake Bay. I think it would be really irresponsible to apply those to Wisconsin. So, which is not a satisfying answer, I'm sorry to say, but yeah. Mhm. Yes, hi.
Do I understand correctly that the Google analysis goes?
So actually our rainfall treatment is at a Huckate. Our outcome is the water quality at the station.
So then you have some sort of spatial reflection up and down to the conversation?
Yeah, so so unfortunately, in order to be able to satisfyingly do upstream downstream, we would need to have an upstream reading on the same day as we have the reading at that given station. And that essentially we lose most of our observations just because the readings themselves are so idiosyncratic, and because we're looking at the daily, like it's very sensitive to being important that it is that given day, right?
So I'm thinking.
Yeah.
That's a good kind of.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of the amount of food that rains this much.
Yep. Yes.
Rains where?
Right.
You know, how far and you know, down, when rain downstream, then that pollution goes that way. Not the
Yeah.
pollution. But if it rains upstream, then it gets produced and then.
Right. So I do think we're doing a nice job of actually measuring rain at the actual location of the reading. So that is, I feel confident in that. I think the question is, would we be concerned, especially when we're thinking about these daily readings, would we be concerned that potentially upstream rain has already had a chance to affect water quality at our station? I think that's an important question of how quickly do we expect the flow from upstream to reach our stations, and would it actually be concurrent on that same day? So that's something to I don't know if you have thoughts on it, or it's daily, exactly, every day. Well, no, it's an incomplete panel, right? That's the, so we know the exact day when the reading takes place, but we don't have readings every single day. Mhm. Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, sorry that I'm not too familiar with that
No. Yes.
information, but like,
Yeah.
I was thinking like with the non-phone NPS pollution,
Mhm.
then how are you like separating, let's say, like the effects from like say like vehicles, pollution from the roads, that also like carry runoffs into the watershed. Like how are we like
Mhm.
like disentangling this effect only to like from the agriculture, but not from NPS from like other factors.
Sure. So you're worried about other forms of pollution that we haven't controlled for, apart from the point source permits and the agriculture.
Yeah, like maybe like the heavy rainfall actually, like maybe like there's like a lot of pollutions from higher particles that from a lot of cars driving on highways, and then there's like stormwater that comes from that flows into like the watershed as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that we're thinking about specific nutrients, right? And so we need to really take into account anything that is going to be a source of nitrogen or phosphorus, right? So the specific example that you referenced, I'm not really worried about nitrogen or phosphorus coming from, but I think it's a valid point that we could, that other forms of nitrogen and phosphorus that are outside of NPDES, outside of those permitted activities or outside of agriculture would not be we would not be controlling for, those would be absorbed into sort of the main effect of the rainfall, right? So just an average across those activities across the state. Yes.
I know it'd be endogenous.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you have data on cover crops.
Yeah.
It seems like that's a pretty cool part of the story.
Yeah.
If you could show other
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
On the agenda.
I agree. And I'd be happy to chat about, I mean, the other activities that I think are important. I think you're right that grazing is important. I'll be honest, in part, we're driven right now by data availability, right? So in my perfect world, we would know spatially specifically where nutrient management plans are, we'd know where tile drainage is, we'd know where some of these other activities, and at this point we don't. Let's see, but grazing I think we certainly could get at from some of the remote sensing data, so that could be really nice. Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you everyone.
As for kids, Control L. All right.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry.
You close the room. Sure. Oh. I could do that. Would have been a lot easier on some of those virtual formats. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming to the Wisconsin show, I guess, for the first half. And you know, I'm happy to see the room filled. They shoved us here in the basement. I thought that we'd just be hanging out with each other, but I'm very happy that you're here to learn more about water quality in Wisconsin. So this project that I'm going to present it's really kind of the combination. It could, please tell me if you think it should be 2 papers, because right now it's kind of a behemoth, but really what we are looking at is this pass-through piece. So how are end users affected by water quality regulations? And I know that economists are famous for saying nobody's ever looked at this, because typically other literatures have a lot of the time, but we are quite confident that we're the first to actually look at water quality. There's a large air quality pass-through literature, but we're really looking at this because we have found ourselves a nice little natural experiment. And then we're also going to be looking at water quality trading. So last summer I was out at PERC in Montana, and I was working on water quality issues. So this is sort of combining pass through with water quality in different ways of achieving compliance with water quality regulations. All right, so motivation. You're all going to learn a lot about Wisconsin's regulations today, I would think. So in 2010, Wisconsin created what was called the phosphorus rule. So it's very big, overarching regulations that create the most stringent water quality standards in the country. So we are talking very, very stringent. I'll get into the specifics in a little bit, but the point sources in the state, basically how Wisconsin, you know, we just heard that agriculture is kind of a big deal in Wisconsin and affects water quality. Well, the Wisconsin legislature, knowing that our water is becoming green and not nice, even though we have a lot of people coming there and spending money to participate in water activities, they decided to really make these laws stringent. And rather than targeting the dairy industry, which is basically politically impossible in Wisconsin, they picked on the point sources. So when I say picked on, I mean these are very, very, very stringent and expensive limits that these facilities must face. And as a result, they have to, you know, pass on these costs more than likely. So the compliance costs can be $10, $20 million. Whereas, you know, implementing something such as no-till or conservation practice might be a lot cheaper elsewhere, right? So I used to work at EPA, and let me tell you, anytime there was a regulation, anytime there was discussion, how end users were affected was a huge point of discussion. Consumer welfare is a very large deal. So we think that this question is very, very important because of these sizable compliance costs from the law. So kind of like Marin, I'm motivating this with some newspaper clippings. So this is Beloit, which is in the southern part of the state, very dirty water. And they're basically saying, look, we're increasing your sewer rates. Sorry, your utility rates as a result of these regulations, because the wastewater treatment plant is now going to be facing millions of dollars of compliance costs because of the phosphorus rule, right? So that's this new regulation that the Beloit Daily News is talking about. So then here's where we are, the first question could be, how do these stringent limits affect my sewer utility bill, right? So then also part of the phosphorus rule, there's different ways of complying. So as I mentioned, you need these expensive technology in order to meet these new limits, but you can also have alternative compliance strategies. And this idea of water quality markets or trading of offsets, right? It's something that economists have been talking about for a very long time, but there are very few successful programs throughout the country. And what we have noticed in Wisconsin is, well, the reason that there's actually trading, that we actually finally have a place with data on water quality trades, is because it's basically the only option, right? I'm a small municipality. I have to install $2 million worth of treatment equipment. Now I'm really trying to go participate in these trades versus these other programs, which necessarily don't have that motivation. So we are then going to look at the differences in cost between technology and trading. And here's part of that same article, but basically what it's saying, and this is kind of leading to our motivation is, well, it would have been $4.5 million to comply with these new regulations in Beloit, but instead it's going to cost about $60,000 each year. So there's a big potential for decreases in costs that just does not exist in other places. So our three primary research questions that we're attempting to answer here. And the first is, what is this compliance cost pass through? So how does this phosphorus rule affect the sewer utility rates of users in Wisconsin? And this is our research question that's very cleanly identified because, as I mentioned, the rollout of this phosphorus rule creates quite a nice natural experiment. And then we're going to look at then that heterogeneity by compliance option. So how are you going to be complying with this rule? And then does that change the impact on the sewer rates? And yeah, that's the last one, right? So actually the second research question is basically, we're just doing a summaries of the Wisconsin program because we have more trades than have really occurred in many other places. So what are the previews? I like this. I read Wikipedia before I watch a movie. So if you don't like the preview, then don't listen. But what we find, as was the case in Beloit, we find an 8 to 11% increase in real sewer utility billing rates for those municipalities that are subject to the phosphorus rule. And so looking at this program, right, it could be theoretically cost effective. Again, economists, we would love markets where they could potentially work. Well, these markets are really working here as compared to the technological mandate. So we see about $17.5 million per year. This value we expect to continue to grow, to get bigger as more and more municipalities are subject to the phosphorus rule. And then we find quite a differential depending on technological upgrade or water quality trading. So it's about 6.5% increase if they're participating in water quality trading versus a 15% increase for those municipalities where they install tertiary treatment technology. So we have these primary contributions. So like I mentioned, pass-through is huge, right? It's something that everybody is interested in when you're talking about new regulations, right? You can't get any sort of regulation through without a discussion of how this is going to affect consumer welfare. So there's a large literature that's looking at various shocks, various other policies. And specifically, though, the electric utilities are facing costly pollution rate regulation. So like I mentioned, there's a relatively large literature looking at this pass-through when it comes to air pollution, but really almost nothing when it comes to water pollution. And what the air pollution articles actually find, almost all of them, is that pass-through is almost 100%. And we expect that to be similar in our case because these are utilities, right, with relatively inelastic demand faced by the consumers, so they're able to pass that on. So then, like I mentioned, we are the first to look at this water quality regulation, and we build off the work recently. Kaiser and Shapiro have a bunch of good things where they're looking at water pollution regulation, and basically they find that, well, there's just not a lot compared to air pollution. There's not a lot of water pollution regulation studies. So we are really the first to look at this on a large scale. And then our second contribution is now where we dig into those, into the water quality trading stuff. So like I mentioned, there's been a couple programs here or there that have facilitated some trade. The Minnesota River, there's been some trading, places in North Carolina, but overall, there really just is not a lot of workable water quality markets, just because the transaction costs are so high, right? There's a very big problem with these markets. And so we're looking at a different one where there's been more trades that's been spurred by this very strict regulation. So again, I live in Wisconsin, so I like it. But even if I lived in North Carolina, I'd probably study the Wisconsin program because it's pretty darn robust compared to the other ones. All right, so now here's my wonderful talk on the part of the institutional framework, right? So bear with me if this is, if you don't care too much about Wisconsin water quality, but it's pretty cool how it sets up for a nice natural experiment for us. So in 2010, the Wisconsin legislature passed, so there's several points of the phosphorus rule, right? The first is NR 102, and that's the water quality standards, right? So as I mentioned, the legislature chose to pick on point sources. So as Maren said, point sources coming from the pipe. In our case, we really care about those wastewater treatment plants, but they can also come from industrial facilities such as chemical manufacturing facilities. There's a lot of pulp and paper mills in Wisconsin as well. So if they are located in a watershed, right, if they're discharging to a water body that doesn't meet what this is called a water quality based effluent limit. So if it doesn't meet that level, then you're subject to now this water quality based effluent limit. So for many of us that have taught, environmental economics, the Clean Water Act originally was set up through these technology-based effluent limits. So technology-based effluent limits say, if you have this sort of technology, you will be discharging at this amount. That used to be 1 milligram per liter in your effluent discharge, right? So now the new standard has just made that very, very, very small. The water quality-based effluent limit then in most places is 0.075. So you can tell that is a very big decrease, right? And so this water quality based effluent limit now, as I keep saying, I don't love point source dischargers or anything, but they really, really got hammered with this rule, right? They now have to, in order to meet that 0.075, you can't do that through cheap options such as chemical additions or ways that they were able to meet the technology-based effluent limit. Now you would have to install a very expensive tertiary filtration system, which can cost $10, $20 million. So these are a very, very big regulatory burden has been placed on these point sources, right? And we don't look at it too much in this paper. We have a kind of an ongoing body of work, but this huge decrease, I was not old enough to be part of writing this regulation, right? But I'm sure all of us could say, well, if you're discharging 80 pounds per month, now your new limit, 80 pounds of phosphorus, your new limit now, you have to discharge only 8 pounds of phosphorus per limit. So that's 72 pounds, right? That's leaking from every dairy throughout the state every month. So really picking, this is just not a very well targeted rule. All right, so then your options. So then the second part of the phosphorus rule, it regulates them beginning with their first national pollutant discharge elimination system permit following the December 1st rule, right? So if my initial permit, so NIPD's permits go every 5 years. If my permit was issued to me in 2008, that means that I'm going to be subject to the phosphorus rule beginning with my first permit in 2013. All right, so these facilities have had time to develop compliance strategies. And this is where we get our water quality trading data, actually. So 3 years after, you have to come up with this idea of how am I going to meet compliance with the new phosphorus rule. Then in year 4, you have to provide your final alternatives. Then when the new permit is issued, you have to say, I'm going to comply with this way. So it's either technology, it's offset trading, those sorts of options. So this is really where our natural experiment comes, because these NIPD's permits are reissued exogenously. Right, so what are we studying? We're studying municipal sewer utilities. So in Wisconsin, these are publicly not investor owned. And the crazy thing is that in Wisconsin, the Public Service Commission regulates water utilities, so where you get your drinking water, but not the sewer utilities. So this is where they're going to be able to set their own rates, determine rules, and for external validity, several states in the Midwest have the same sort of regulatory framework. So where do we use our data, or where do we gather our data? So we have to know the NIPI's permit information, right? We have to know when these permits were issued, when they were reissued. So we gather that from ECHO. The phosphorus rule compliance. So this is where these facilities then are telling the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources how they're going to meet that 0.075 milligram per liter new limit. And so we gathered these reports from DNR and we scraped the PDF files for information about what they're doing. Then we gather the utility billing rates. So as I mentioned, these are they're publicly owned, but they're not regulated. So we gathered this through a survey with a consulting company. And then we have a balance panel from 2001 to 2019. So our empirical framework then, so like I mentioned, this is a very nice setting for us, but it's a two-way fixed effects model where we're looking at the basically treatment is now you're subject to this Wisconsin phosphorus rule. So we're using this exogenous temporal variation on the reissuance of that permit date. So then our treatment is going to be BAM that 5 year after your first permit reissuance. And then we do all the recent stuff that you have to do with two-way fixed effects. So this is where we find just the effect of this law or the phosphorus rule. This is your 8 to 11%. That's what we find here. Very robust across all the specifications. The middle specification, we eliminate all those facilities from the control group that are not part of an impaired watershed. So that's kind of just based on timing is our treatment. And we find very similar effects there as well. And then, so now I only have 2 minutes, so I'm just going to burn through the water quality stuff. You, like I said, tell me if this should be 2 papers, depending on my time, maybe it should. But water quality markets are great. Okay, like I said, clearly I'm a puppet for water quality trading, but they're very good in theory. They've shown to work. So what's happening here? We're basically transferring the ability to stop pollution in Wisconsin's waters. Well, we're going from the point sources where, again, the marginal benefits are very, very low at this point, right? Kaiser and Shapiro have done a great job showing that point source regulation was fantastic for the first 20 years. And now it's pretty much ran its course. We really need to go to the non-point stuff. So here's where we're saying overall $17.5 million per year is saved when those facilities are choosing to engage in offset trading versus just installing that technology. And the also, and again, I could talk about this for a very long time, but the ratio then is 2.4 to 1, meaning that in the offset trading, the facilities are actually, for every pound that you would have had to decrease your phosphorus by under a technological option, you're going to be decreasing phosphorus from a non-point source by 2.4 pounds. So ex ante, it's also better for water quality. So then here's where our results, what we really care about here is this linear combination effect. That's going to tell us the effect from those facilities that are complying via water quality trading. So the comply then, that's going to be those facilities that are complying with the phosphorus rule via technology. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is our 14% effect for those facilities that are using tech. This is about our 6% effect for those facilities that are complying with offset trading. So not only ex ante is it better for water quality, it's also better for consumer welfare when we're using these water quality markets. So I'm thinking I'm out of time, but basically again, here's me being a shill for water quality trading, just ways to get this to happen. Wisconsin's a very interesting case study because water quality trades are actually occurring. And it was basically because of the push of the Wisconsin DNR picking on the point sources. So basically what we're saying is, yes, obviously there's going to be compliance pass through. If we're going to want to decrease our water quality issues, trading is basically the best way to do it for everybody. Okay.
Very thin amounts of trading.
Yep.
So you said that is certainly not the case here, and that these are very active.
Okay, so I don't want to say very comparatively. Comparatively, they're very active. Yeah.
Okay.
These markets are very thin. The transaction costs are so high, but it's really because there's no incentive for either party to participate in it, right? You can, with these old technology-based effluent limits, meeting a 1 milligram per liter discharge ratio is pretty darn easy, or discharge limit is pretty easy. You can do it by basically pumping chlorine into your water. But when it comes to this new phosphorus rule 0.075 water quality based effluent limit, now the wastewater treatment plants are saying, I can't afford $20 million for a filtration system. Now they're getting out in the world trying to find these trades. So it's almost like the thin markets now, they're a bit more robust because of this state law that's making it so darn expensive. Yeah, so like I mentioned, these are completely unregulated. So it's a little different, right? If we were looking at the drinking water utilities, it'd be a lot easier. But most of them, yes, they would have to have some sort of loan. They usually factor all of that into the rates. But yeah, that's a little bit more of a black box than it would be for a publicly regulated. And a lot of these from Wisconsin, they're very small. So we've been told there could be potential funneling of money from, the parks program to the sewer utilities. So it's kind of a black box. But yeah, most of these are financed through capital project loans. I would love to look more into that too. All right. Thank you much.
Hello, everyone. Is it? I think it is sharing.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming here. I'm Xiaoyu Zhang, and today my presentation topic is understanding public acceptability of climate policies in Europe. As we all know that climate change topic is very hot right now, and we have a global goal of limit the global warming under 2 degrees in this century. So the urgent actions need to be taken immediately. But the policymakers have a very wide range of policy instruments to mitigate the climate change, from the conventional policy instrument like the command and control to the market-based instrument. Like the carbon pricing, which to put a price on carbon, is widely supported by economists as a cost-effective tool for emission reductions. But however, only 45 national jurisdictions have implemented carbon pricing initiatives, and only 27 tax carbons. That is according to the World Bank's 2021 report. Why so few? The main reason is that people hate carbon pricing, especially for carbon taxation. So a common explanation for the rejection of climate policies by the public has been the outright denial of climate change, and climate change is perceived as a future event competing with more pressing demands. People may only care about the current generation and more maybe economic benefit, but we don't really face to the concerns that the next generations would face. And another explanation would be the learned helplessness. It is fun to moderate the link of using climate change concerns to predict people's pro-environmental behaviors. We really care about climate change. We really have a very high level of concerns, but because of the learned helplessness, we don't take actions to do that, because we we may think that we cannot save the world, like the single actions cannot like make the world better. So like for example, like in France, like the Yellow Vest protests erupted in 2018 after the French government like proposed to increase fossil fuels taxes. Like it is like regarded as the uneven tax policies and privilege for the upper class, because people think that upper class may not pay much in the carbon tax, but like maybe people living in the poor areas and they may spend much more on like fossil fuels, on the traditional energy. That makes like maybe poor people need to pay much on the like fossil fuels tax. And like in the existing studies, people like revealed 5 reasons for why people hate carbon taxation. The first one is the perception of high personal cost, and the second one is the perceived low efficiency in discouraging high carbon behavior. And the third one is potential regressivity. And the fourth one is fear of negative effects on the economies. Like people may think like implementing carbon taxation would decrease people's employment rate, and it would maybe lower the GDP per capita in the regions that have high dependencies to the traditional like industry. And the last one is the most important one, that like a lot of studies like have discussed the lack of trust in the government. Like people may think like the existing studies thought that people with high political trust in government may have higher support for the carbon tax, that it is like directly the support of carbon tax is directly associated from to the like people to the people's trust level to the government, to the political trust, to the political party, and especially like in the country level. So like we have the, so therefore we have the expectation that the contribution there's a gap that between the existing studies and the real situation of the carbon taxation and other climate policies, public acceptabilities, because like existing studies mainly concentrated on the individual level and the country level variations in the public acceptabilities. But there's no studies like talk about the spatial distribution, spatial characteristics effect on the people's acceptabilities of climate policies, because like they think like individuals' characteristics like the political trust or the demographic informations, or like which country they live in would affect people's attitudes towards the climate policies. But there's no one talk about like which area you are living in, like in which region would increase your support, your individual attitude towards the carbon tax or other climate policies. So we feel in this gap that how the specific drivers of public acceptance differ among alternative policies instruments. And we also compare the drivers of public support for the 3 alternative policies to combat climate change, carbon taxation, including carbon taxation, renewable energy subsidies, and energy efficiency law. And so our main contribution is to combine survey data from the 8th round of European social survey, that is ESS8, with regional social, economic, and environmental indicators to provide a comprehensive comparative analysis of the drivers of public perception of those 3 climate policies. The data is from 2 parts. The first part is individual factors that is derived from the ESS8. Like this survey is targeted for like it's conducted in 2016 and targeted to like survey respondents, like how do they feel about the energy use and climate change policies. So the first one is public perception of climate policies. That is the dependent variables we use in this paper. And the others, including political trust, climate change concern, perceived unemployment, egalitarian attitude, left and right political views, and other demographic information are also from ESS8 survey. But a main contribution in our paper is to combine the individual factors with the regional factors, like based on the North region. Since the ESS8 survey it's like surveyed about 44,000 observations around 23 countries in Europe. And it is based on region. So we combine that with individual survey data with the regional factors, including GDP per capita, unemployment rate, annual mean PM2.5 population weighted exposure, and also a country level variable, that is the national electricity price, to say like if the spatial characteristics, including the socio-economic factors and environmental factors, would influence people's attitudes, like for the 3 different climate policies. Here is a graph showing the mean national support for 3 carbon policies. The blue one is the carbon tax support, and the red one is renewable energy subsidy support, and the green one is the energy efficiency law support. We can see that people really hate carbon taxation. Like it has the lowest support, like across all the countries in Europe. And compared to the like among the 3 different policies, we can see that renewable energy subsidy support is the highest, like people really like subsidy. And energy efficiency law support, it's like, because from the survey, it is captured by the answer to the question that to what extent that you are in favor or against to use some, to replace your appliance with energy efficiency appliance. So it is more like an individual. It's more like an individual action rather than general carbon tax, general climate change policies that influence industry and individual household life. And from these 2 graphs, we show the PM2.5 exposure based on not regional level. And another one is unemployment rate. It is the same as our expectation that the North Europe has the lowest exposure to air pollutant, and it has the highest employment rate. And we can see that the eastern part of the Europe, it faces a very high level of exposure to the air pollutant. Here we use PM2.5 since it is a very significant indicators to indicate the level of the regional local pollutant. And from the unemployment rate, we can see that in Spain, it faces a very like severe situation about the unemployment rate. Since we are using the survey data and merged with regional factors and national factors, so we do think the combined data set has a hierarchical structure. So we use multi-level random intercept regression model. That is, like from the equation, we can see that the individual I are nested in the region. K is from 1 to 254. We have 254 regions and from 19 countries. That is after we drop in the missing variables. That like the rest of after dropping the missing variables, we have about 22,402 observations. And Y represents the extent of individual I support for the specific climate policies, like it's carbon taxation, renewable energy subsidy, and energy efficiency law. and X is the vector of individual variables, and Z is the vector of regional variables representing the socio-economic and environmental indicators, including GDP, unemployment rate, average annual exposure to PM 2.5, and PG only includes the national level in variables, that is the electricity price. From the regression results, this panel A shows the level 1 regression results, like among 3 different climate policies, that is carbon tax, renewable energy subsidy, and energy and efficiency law. We found it very consistent with existing literature that climate change concern and political trust are still very dominant variables to predict the carbon tax, to predict the support of three climate policies. And this one is the rest of the results, but we need to the perceived unemployment is quite interesting, that it is the perceived unemployment rate is it's the individual perceived unemployment rate in the country, but not the real unemployment rate. We also add the real unemployment rate in the region that individual is living in. So we see that unemployment rate is insignificant, but the perceived unemployment is quite significant. That is that the real unemployment rate would not change people's attitude, but your perceived level of unemployment rate would change your attitude, especially in the carbon taxation. And another interesting finding is that the rural area, whether you are living in the rural area, would change your attitude about the carbon tax. That is, if you're living in the rural area, you would hate carbon taxation compared to urban area, but it would not influence your attitude towards the renewable energy subsidy and energy efficiency law. I think it is because you can control, if you are using renewable energy, or if you are using energy efficiency appliance, but you cannot control the carbon taxation, and the people living in the rural area may spend much more energy compared with people living in the urban area. And another one is very quite interesting consequences is the age, older people may in favor of energy efficiency law, but they would be more against to the carbon tax and renewable energy subsidy. And the panel B is the special characteristics of the effect on the 3 different climate policies. We found that PM 2.5, that is that's the indicators of the local air pollutant. It would not influence carbon tax, but it would influence renewable energy subsidy and energy efficiency law. And GDP per capita would influence carbon tax, but not influence renewable energy subsidy and energy efficiency law. And in level 3, the national electricity price would increase energy efficiency law support. That is quite it is easy to interpret, because with high national electricity price, we may think that, oh, it is too high, I cannot afford the electricity price, so I would like to use energy efficiency, more to save more energy, to save more money. So in the discussion, we think there are three vital conclusions we have. That the first one is living area really influence people's choice in climate policies, because residents who are living in the rural area are more likely to be opposed to carbon taxation policies, but people living in the polluted area with high exposure to PM 2.5 are more likely to vote for renewable energy subsidy policy or energy efficiency law. And it is opposite to our expectation that the real unemployment rate doesn't make any sense in predicting people's attitudes towards climate policies, but the high perceived national unemployment rate would increase public aversion of all the climate policies, especially for carbon tax. and residents living in a well-developed region with high GDP per capita are more willing to vote for carbon tax. But high national electricity price would increase citizens' support for energy efficiency law. So we have some policy implications here. The first one is about air pollutant. Like we can make a link from like local air pollutant with the carbon or carbon taxation or climate policies. The local pollutant would not like make people be more desire to like vote for carbon taxation, but it can help people to increase their support for the other two climate policies. And another one is about unemployment rate. Also, like the unemployment rate, real situation cannot change people's attitudes. That is like to promoting the carbon taxation or to promoting other climate policies. We need to make policymakers to make sure to like let citizens know that the real unemployment rate is not like consistent with what they perceive, and makes the bias smaller, help people to implement the climate policies. Yes. Sorry, any question? It's an index. Actually, it is from 0 to 4. 0 means like strongly against, and 4 means strongly in favor. Yeah, it is just from the survey, like to ask the respondents to answer like if they are like strongly in favor or strongly against to the carbon tax or other climate policies.
I guess real quick,
yeah.
what was the, I guess, the mean on that index for carbon tax support? Was it around 2?
Yes. Actually, it is like some below 2, but some like higher. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for staying with us, everyone. So
sorry, could you please share the screen?
Oh, I thought it was. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Is that better? I get it. So yeah, thank you for sticking with us. And I'm Pablo Ordonez. I'm presenting some work I'm doing with colleague Mateo Souza with the Universidad Carlos III in Madrid. And this is, preliminary work to try to make sense of like the results and just like trying to, wrap our heads around the best way of presenting this. So we're gonna be presenting work we've been doing on looking at the effect of Colombia's carbon tax on the manufacturing sector. So, I mean, the motivation, I'm going to skip the part about what, like, how important climate change is and go to like the mechanism, like the policies that we can use to address it. And carbon pricing, is viewed as one of the most cost-effective ways of reducing carbon emissions. It also creates incentives to innovate and a whole other host of benefits that, we as economists favor. And as such, it's been adopted in some countries. Only 36 countries in the world have some form of carbon pricing. According to like the latest, the World Bank has a carbon pricing dashboard. It shows what the kind of a carbon pricing it is, either like carbon tax or ETS. But as a carbon tax, there are only 36 countries in the world who currently have any form of carbon pricing. And it's common that, most of these policies are gonna like exempt some sectors, some fuels, just in order to be able to get it passed through like the legislatures and to be able to, implement them, because they're gonna face some very heavy political opposition from some sector or another, which is the case in Colombia too, and these are very rare in developing countries. Only a handful of countries I know, like Mexico, Chile, Colombia has it, that I know of, have a carbon tax. Most of the countries are going to be based in Europe, and there are some parts of Canada, British Columbia also have a carbon tax in place. But it's a feature of developed economies, and only a couple of, developing countries are going to have a form of carbon pricing. So the questions that we're asking is, are these carbon taxes, even though they're incomplete in the sense of some sectors are exempt or some sorts of fuels are going to be exempt from it, are they still effective at promoting a transition to lower emissions for the manufacturing sectors? And can they do so in a way that doesn't affect, productivity growth and the growth of the firms, the competitiveness, which is like a main worry of the manufacturing sector. And to tie it up to the existing literature, there has been like extensive work looking at the effect that energy costs have on the manufacturing sector. And there has been some work focusing precisely on the carbon taxes for the manufacturing sector. Specifically in the UK, there's one that's a very similar setting to the one we have here, looking at the effect that it has, showing the reduction in emissions, a reduction in use of like the tax fuels, but no effects on employment or sales. And same for Yamasaki's work on British Columbia, looking at total employment. For developing countries, we all know only of one other study that's focused on the elimination of fossil fuels for the manufacturing sector in Indonesia, and finds very similar results to like the two previous studies. And so, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first study to like look at a precise like carbon tax and the effect that it has in the manufacturing sector in a developing country so far. So a bit of background on the policy. Colombia implemented this carbon tax at the end of 2016. I'm from Colombia. The government made a big push to join the OECD, and like as part of the negotiations, one of the conditions was the implementation of a carbon tax. And so they passed a tax reform that included this carbon tax in 2016, and began being levied in 2017. It's very low. It's around $5 per ton of CO2, and it's charged at the first point of sale. So it's very easy to charge, and it's a very easy way to like raise revenue for the government. So basically, any distributor selling any of these tax fuels is going to like tax according to the conversion rate between the fuel and the emission factors from the fuel to CO2, basically. And it's going to tax carbon-intensive fuels with the exception of coal and gas, which is kind of funny. Especially, I mean, coal has a very big, it's a very big industry. Like it's a big export in Colombia, and they have like a very strong political group. So that was, I guess, like one of the ways in which you could like pass the legislation we have without having like major opposition. The power sector in Colombia is fairly clean. Around 70% hydro, and then the rest, mostly natural gas and some coal and some diesel. So there's very little effect that it's going to have on electricity prices. And so the data that we're using, so just to recap, so we're going to be like, leveraging the fact that some of these fuels are not taxed to be able to measure, how much like the power plant, the manufacturing establishments are affected by the carbon tax before and after it was implemented. So the data that we're going to use is Colombia's annual manufacturing survey, which is actually a census of all the manufacturing establishments with at least 10 employees and like a minimum of sales. So we have a panel of 6,600 establishments from 2012 to 2019. A whole host of variables, fuel consumption, sales, investments, number of employees, like everything you can think of for eight years. We like stop at 2020 for obvious reasons, and then we're also going to have like local sector and department, which is like the equivalent of the states in Colombia indicators. So to show you what like what this distribution of, or how like carbon intensive these sectors are, and how much variation there is, I just want to like quickly show you this table. So you're gonna see the sectors, and for each sectors, the first column is gonna show you before the implementation of the carbon tax, how much of all the emissions from the manufacturing sector were focused on each one of these different sectors. So for example, if you see chemical products, they account for 62% of the total emissions from the manufacturing sectors. If you see the three first ones, chemical, food, and non-metallic minerals accounts for almost 83%, 84% of the total emissions of the sectors. And then the other ones are going to have very low weight on the total emissions of the manufacturing sector. And the second column is going to show you how much of the fuels on average that the sectors use are going to be the fuels that are actually taxed under the carbon tax that was implemented. So 95%, 96% of the fuels that are used by the chemical products manufacturing sector are taxed. And then you're going to have a whole range of variation. So this is going to be like our carbon intensity measure that we're going to use to be able to estimate the effect of the carbon tax. And I'll show you in a little bit what the specification looks like. I just want you to keep in mind this a huge variation in terms of the weight of the carbon emissions in the total sector and the variability that there is in how carbon intensive each one of these sectors is. So this graph shows you basically for each one of the years how much of the emissions come from each one of the specific fuels. So from natural gas, it's around 45–50%. The rest, another 40% is going to be coal. And then if we focus on the fuels that are actually taxed, which are diesel, LPG, gasoline, and like a couple of others, minor ones, it's around like 4%, very, very low taxation, very like low effect of, actually like the emissions that are taxed don't have a lot of weight on the total emissions for the manufacturing sector. So these are all the fuels that are actually going to be taxed. Accounts like for 4% of the total emissions of the sector of the manufacturing sector. And how big of a deal the tax is. So we convert this all the fuels and the prices to megajoules, so have a same unit of comparison and compare based on the carbon intensity of each one of the fuels, how much will be levied from the tax and what that represents from the the average price. So for diesel it would be around 2% increase, gasoline 1.4% increase, and LPG would be 1.5% increase. So again, also a very low incidence of tax. And just to get a sense of the timeline, because it's going to matter for the way in which we specify our treatment variable, we use look at the Google trends for impuesto al carbono, which is carbon tax in Spanish. So this is before, should be 2016 here. So before 2016, there was some talk of it while the Colombian government was in negotiations with the OECD. And then the legislation was passed at the end of 2016, and it started being implemented or charged in 2017. So we're going to use this exposure intensity before 2016 as our treatment variable. And the way we construct this exposure intensity is basically we take all the fuels that are used by a given establishment before 2016, convert them to megajoules so we can have the actual energy usage, and see what the weight of the actual tax fuel, so diesel, gasoline, LPG, is over that total energy consumption before 2016. And that basically tells us, how much of the energy that is used by a given establishment comes from a tax fuel. So if 20% of your energy usage comes from tax fuel, you're less exposed than someone or an establishment that uses 80% of its energy from tax fuel. And so we use this measure of exposure intensity in a event study specification, and for each fuel we regress interactions between year dummies and the tax share, and then we include establishment fixed effects, sector by year fixed effects, and state by year fixed effects, and then we use cluster the standard errors at the company level. So a given company can have several manufacturing establishments. If you manufacture shoes, you can have 2 different factories in different sectors, in different regions, for example. And so what we find when we estimate the effect of the carbon tax on using this exposure intensity measure is that we're going to use 2015 as our base year because the tax came into law in 2016 and it began being levied in 2017. We find that there's an increase in the consumption of gas and a very marginal increase in the consumption of coal, and the magnitudes are quite high. 40. If you just look at 2016, for example, these are inverse hyperbolic signs. So when you do the conversion at the mean level, which is 38% of the carbon intensity, it's going to be a 42% increase in the consumption of natural gas after the implementation of the carbon tax, and then a 2.4% increase for coal. And then for the tax fuels, we see that there's a big decrease as well in the consumption of diesel, gasoline, and LPG. In 2016, this amounted to a 28% decrease in diesel, 50% decrease in gasoline, and 27% decrease in LPG. And the other thing we looked at was the effect on total energy consumption, to get a sense of what the net effect would be. And we find that, decrease, it's not significant in 2016, but it's significant for the following years, up to 29% in 2019. So we're finding very big effects, and that's something we're still working on because it doesn't track with, well, I don't want to say it doesn't track, but given the the magnitude of the tax and the magnitude of the actual emissions that were taxed, but we're seeing very large effects. So that's something we're still working on, trying to flesh out. And so just to conclude, we see a reduction in the use of the tax fuels and an increase in the consumption of the untaxed fuels, reduction in total energy use, and we are finding that the effects are actually pretty big given the level of the tax. For as a preview, not preview, but as something we're thinking about doing for future work, basically looking at does this lead to any incentives to innovate? Are people actually adopting technologies that allow them to save energy? And we found, using the same sample, it's going to be an unbalanced panel, basically a survey that asked them have you implemented new technologies to reduce your energy consumption? So we're going to use that data to see if the ones that are more affected by the tax actually adopt technologies that allow them to save energy. And the other effect, related to the point before is, are there effects on local air pollution? If we're seeing these big decreases, and there's like changes, fortunately the coal is not that much. There's a big increase in switching to gas, which is cleaner than the other one. So there might be a reduction in local air pollution from when in areas that are more, there's a higher concentration like switching happening. And that's pretty much it. Thank you. I think we have 2 minutes for questions, so yeah.
So your outcome is the usage of these tools. Have you, in the paper, do you do some sort of back and look?
No, I mean, I have something that I'm hesitant to show because I still like trying to work out what the right way of seeing, if there are actually like net reductions in CO2 emissions. But yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I was curious, like with the, I guess, Colombia's plan, when you like said, you mentioned about, the economic design. So, so is the policy only requiring like taxing carbon, or is it like, was there any like discussion on any tax rate instead of like analyzing maybe?
Yeah, there's actually, which is it's still like under implementation, carbon offsets. So basically ways of buying carbon credit for mostly is replanting of forests or those kinds of projects that you can that the Ministry of Environment has to certify that are actually reducing or offsetting emissions. So instead of paying for the tax, you can buy credits, carbon credits from that through that mechanism, but it's still under implementation. Yeah. Yeah. I think there was some discussion I read the government proposal, and I think there was a mention of extending the taxes to coal. So we'll see if it actually happens. And to your second point, sorry, can we?
And then I was wondering, if that taxes that be kind of benefit.
Right. Yeah, I think it would be tricky because everyone has been treated at this point, so defining who will be like our untreated group or that. Yeah, I think I will have to think more about that, but I don't know exactly how we could do it. Yeah, thank you. Well, I think we're at time. Well, thank you everybody, and thank you for sticking around.